All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Jury President. I really appreciate. My name is Vivien GARNES. I've been working under the supervision and tutelage of Professor Goudarzi, as you mentioned, and I'm very grateful to be given the opportunity to defend my work about influencer marketing RI to the jury here today. So I'll start with my favorite slide, the slide with my face on it. My name is Vivien GARNES, as I mentioned. I'm an entrepreneur. I co-founded a company which is one of the world leaders in influencer marketing technology, which not only sprouted really my interest in the field and allowed me to get an understanding of what potential problem and research could be carried out, but also really get access to an unprecedented amount of data, which put me in a very unfair position almost to carry out the research. And the problem I encountered looked something like this, is that empirically influencer marketing, quote unquote, works, right? And you're going to tell me, Vivien, this is the opposite of a problem, and you would be quite right. So here's the kicker. The idea is that quote unquote working means different things for different organizations, right? Some companies are very looking for awareness, right? They're looking for notoriety, reach, impressions, these kind of vanity metrics. On the other end of the spectrum, some companies are really looking to generate attributable sales, right? So different objectives, different goals. So really different things to go after. And yet there is no consensus, not in the professional world, not in the academic world either, on what influencer marketing return on investment looks like, right? On what it is, what kind of terminology, what kind of method of calculation. And as a result, it's virtually impossible to really pinpoint and understand what positively impacts it and what negatively impacts it as a result, right? And last but not least, but one cannot really predict what cannot measure. At least that's how I like to think about this. So we're in this situation where it's a little bit of a status quo, a little bit of hiatus, where not the professionals, the practitioners, nor the researchers have really managed to put a dent into that problematic. And turning this problem into research questions, right? I phrased it the following way. So how can marketing professionals, number one, accurately measure, and number two, proactively predict their return on influencer marketing investment? And this question I've decided to break it down in 4 different research goals. Goal number one being to clarify the terminology on which return on investment is based. Number two, to really provide to the industry, especially to the practitioners, a system that they can use to really accurately measure ROIMI, return on influencer marketing investment. Goal number three, to go to the level of understanding that we can really pinpoint which variables positively or negatively impact ROIMI. And last, and that's the most ambitious goal of all, to a degree predict ROIMI, right? And to provide the tools to practitioners to really anticipate what kind of influencers are going to generate what kind of ROIs. So to answer these, first, let's look at the literature. Ironically, almost, influencer marketing has been worked on quite extensively by the academic world, which is great, but never really in the space of interest of this research, which is number one, sales attribution, so the ability to generate attributable sales, and number two, cost quantification. So what kind of budgets am I going to allocate to influencers to maximize ROI, a high ROI? This is hard to say. And this has been true for influencer marketing. This has been true for also macro spaces like social media marketing, digital marketing. It's also been true for adjacent spaces, word of mouth marketing, customer engagement. All these spaces have not been looked into to that degree as well. So trying to do justice to the literature review here, I tried to map a little bit more of a seminal work and categorize it to really understand who discusses what and which facets of influencer marketing are being explored. And none of them really quantify cost nor returns, finding number one. Number two, only a handful, really a minority of them refer to the fact that influencer marketing can generate sales potentially, or even, to a degree, impact and influence buying decisions. And last, none of them have really looked into the fact that it can cost money and the budget need to be looked into as well, right? One step further on this, probably the ultimate admission of guilt is this. The market has started to create alternatives to ROI, meaning academics have done that, but also practitioners, instead of looking into ROI, which is a very known metric, they started to provide other metrics, alternative metrics, which do not factor sales attribution nor investments, right? So the AVE, the EMV, the SMIV, all that fun stuff have been created for that purpose. And I'm using the expression admission of guilt because in truth, it's really hard to do that, right? Because to look into ROI properly, you need data. Not only on the client side to get the sales information, you also need data on the supply side, on the influencer side. And very, very few people happen to have both, right? You also need infrastructure. It's not that easy to track sales, to have really an undisputable way to attribute sales. So all of this really substantiates the literature gap and the justification for this research in the first place. And zooming out, if you really look at everything, including the gray literature, so I'm being a little bit more generous with the term literature here, we find that some of the work touches on ROI, which is great, but, and that's a pretty big but, number one, it's all based on declarative data, so nothing on really observed data. And number two, it's a level of understanding that's not nearly granular enough, not actionable enough. What I mean by that is if you look at both the returns and the investments, there's no understanding at the influencer level, nor at the post or publication level, right? Which means that it's barely actionable at all by practitioners, because they cannot take away findings and recommendations to really improve which influencers to work on, how to maximize the budget, or how to tweak their posts in such a way that it generates more ROI as well. So really, wrapping it all up, three levels of gap in this literature. Number one, the definitions really fail to address attributable sales and budgets. They propose alternative metrics which are unsatisfactory from my point of view. Number two, there's really a failure to quantify declarative information. There's also the wrong level of analysis. There's nowhere near actionable enough for practitioners. And third, a little bit less relevant, to the research, but still an interesting gap nonetheless, which I've added to further research. Side note, there's contradictory studies on the impact of the legal disclosure for influencer marketing, which I thought was interesting. And more relevant to research, there's also doubt for the role of demographics on influencer marketing performance, which we'll talk about in a few slides. And there we go. So the research, the way it was carried out, is extremely quantitative. Again, I was in a lucky position to have a very unfair access to plenty of data, which is great. So that research has been designed to support more of an inductive approach. And I suspect that there will be some of the questions along these lines, meaning rather than coming up with hypotheses, and trust me, as a practitioner, had a ton, and then proving them, I wanted to let the data reveal the findings themselves, right? And so I worked in 4 different stages. Number one, data collection. So how to get the data from real life client, from real life influencers, generating real purchases online. Number two, to process that data to really enrich it. So what I've done to gain a deeper understanding and deeper insights, I've enriched it thanks to third-party APIs, including some image recognition technology, to really get a greater data from this. Number three, normalize the data to make it easy to process and easily interpretable. And last, really to turn the data into actionable recommendations thanks to SEM structural equation modeling work. So now let me tell you about the sample. The composition is pretty healthy, almost $6 million of GTV, gross transaction value, for about 7,500 conversions from 75 almost unique brands, 237 unique influencers. But the lower unit of my data set was really the couple influencer brand with all the sales generated from that front. One caveat: the distribution of brands is a little bit skewed towards the head tail of the distribution, but yet we were in a sufficient volume to be statistically significant. Now, I wanted to share with you a little dilemma that we had during the research. And the first decision was which output variable to use for the model, right? Evidently, it's written on the cover page of the thesis, the end game is ROI, right? That makes sense. However, ROI, if you zoom all the way out in its simplest form, it's calculated by GTV divided by cost. So if an input variable in the model maximizes both the GTV and the costs, it will potentially have a neutral effect on ROI. So ROI in itself could be insufficient to really spot the right input variables, right? So I needed for this model to work with intermediary variables as well. And the logical choice would have been GTV and cost, of course, because there are two main components of ROI. However, there we go. However, orders came through as a really good proxy for GTV with basically almost a correlation of 1, meaning that working with multiple linear regression analysis showed to be a much more predictable variable as well. So in the end, using a SEM structural equation modeling, we ended up with a model that looks something like this. And again, all measures here are based on observed data. And the SEM model revealed 3 input variables, which are influencer followers, influencer average comments, influencer average likes, 3 of which were very statistically significant in terms of the coefficients, but also had very low p-values. So 3 input variables, but also 2 output variables, the endgame, the RI, as I just mentioned, but also the intermediary output that we discussed in the previous slide, which is the orders, right? And I was also interested to see if there was any moderation effect at play here, meaning if all the variables were affecting the strength of the statistical relationship between input and output. And I'll be telling you more about that in the next slide. But very simply put, the findings were the following. Number 1, input variables who show a positive relationship with orders have a negative relationship with RI, right? Meaning that even though they generate more sales, their impact on cost is greater than their impact on sales, making it on paper a net negative, right? So that may sound trivial, but it's not that trivial. It's actually pretty interesting, and we'll unpack this in the next few slides. The other thing that was a little bit of a shock was the likes, which composes the majority of engagements, which unfortunately is still very much the gold standard in the industry, actually negatively affects orders, right? So a little bit of a shocker here as well. Back to the moderation variables, I really wanted to explore extensively all the potential moderation effects, and really, especially in the audience, in the relationship between the brand audience and the influencer audience. And unfortunately, the answer is a little bit inconclusive here, because it turns out, as you can see on the graph, that my clients were a little too good at selecting influencers that really match their criteria on an audience base, meaning that the distribution is very backloaded. So here on the x-axis, you have the cosine similarity score for the age, the country, and the gender. So the clients were very good at selecting influencers who have an audience that's very similar to theirs as a brand. So very little, too little example of low cosine similarity for it to be very exploitable. Still, based on these findings, if I zoom out, I'll move now to the managerial recommendations, right? And I'll insist on 2 main ones, even though there are a few more on the thesis itself. And the first one is the identification of the key variables to prioritize in order to maximize ROI during the influencer selection stage, which is very much my research goal number 3, right? I took the liberty to go over research goals number 1 and 2. And it looks something like this. A tiny bit of context before I dig into this. Number 1, before this research, the industry took a couple of things for granted. Number 1, that cost determination was based almost entirely on followers and engagement. And we've established in the SEM model that both of them actually have a negative impact on ROI. So I'd like to let that sink in, right? The market had it been doing wrong for all this time, which I think is incredible. Number 1. Number 2, that not a single platform, meaning an influencer marketing platform out there, was splitting engagement between likes and comments, right? Even though these are 2 very different indications of interest from followers, they were always packaged as one metric, as the engagement rate, right? And not a single one has really looked into splitting them, even though they have virtually opposite effects on ROI. So in a nutshell, the key variables are this. Practitioners to really maximize their ROI, they need to maximize the number of followers and the number of comments, which makes sense. However, they need to find an alternative method for cost determination to really maximize their ROI and stretch their marketing dollars. Number 1. Number 2, they need to minimize the volume of likes, especially in high engagement rate influencers, which sounds super counterintuitive, but happens to be true. And 3, to really maximize engagement growth rate in influencers to minimize cost, right? So influencers who are rising stars, they tend to be cheaper than what they're worth, and that's something to explore as well. So if I give you a little bit of personal perspective here, these findings may sound a little bit trivial, but they already yielded a lot of value for my company's clients. because I've applied these findings to my software, offering to my clients new filters and new ways to interact with influencers with visual recommendations in mind, number one. Number two, we've written up a lot of influencer selection recommendations so they can apply the right level of decisions to really leverage these findings. And three, we're actually even training a machine learning model on influencers' ability to sell based on these findings. So I'm very excited to see what the future holds for that one. But all of these recommendations, they all depend on a better understanding of cost determination, right? As we discussed. And the good news is that's my following managerial recommendation, and that's what it's all about. All right, so the second one, I'm going to propose an integration for cost determination that really predicts ROI to a fairly accurate amount, correlation 0.66, and really increase ROI compared to a baseline. And it's all based on that. So before putting together the SEM model I just described, I run a number of multiple linear regression analysis. And here's the one for orders as an output variable. So here we'll see the same usual suspects: influential followers, influential average likes, and average comments. But that gave me the chance to get coefficients for each input variables to have a degree of predictability on the output variable, right? And so I'm going to propose the following. I know this is not going to get me a Fields medal, but bear with me. Let's imagine that as a brand, I want my ROI to be superior to R, right? Which is my objective pre-campaign that I want to do. Because ROI in its simplest form equals GTV divided by cost, that ratio needs to be also superior to R. And if I flip this around, that means that my cost needs to be inferior to GTV divided by R. And because we know that GTV is the product of orders and the average order value, that means that this ratio divided by R needs to be superior to cost. And because we have the coefficients that can help us predict an influencer's propensity to generate orders, we have an equation that looks something like this, an inequation that looks something like this. Cost needs to be inferior to alpha times influencer followers plus beta times influencer average comments plus omega influencer average likes times gamma, which is again the average order value divided by R, right? So I know that sounds unnecessarily complicated, but still bear with me because you're going to tell me that this is all well and fun, but this is theoretical and this is a DBA, so it has to be somewhat practical, right? And you'd be quite right. So I've chosen to put this to the test, and I've run a very simple experiment, which is to compare the quote unquote original method of cost determination that the sample was using, which was entirely based on follower counts, and it essentially was follower count divided by 129 equals cost. And compared that with the model that I just showcased, which is based on the inequation you've just been walked through. And I'll pause here for now. So this is basically blue and orange. I'll pause here before I go to marine blue, but just that yielded significant improvement, both on the average ROI and the median ROI, right? So that's already a huge win in my book. Because at the scale of my business, we have 1,300 clients. That's potentially worth millions and millions of dollars, and that's extra value I can bring to the table. So that's great. However, the model had one obvious weakness, which meant that it was overpaying some influencers who had, let's say, an above market comment rate or abnormal comment rates. So I decided to go for a third route, which was the best of both worlds route, which is here written as BOBW. And basically was the lesser of original or model, right? So whatever formula pays less, that's what is going to be offered to creators, to influencers. And that offered a marginal improvement, but an improvement still, which got us basically to plus 55% on both average ROI and median ROI between original and BOBW. So I'm going to leave you with the following thoughts. We're at 19 minutes exactly, so I'm making good time. I'm in the business of marketing technology, which means that whether I like it or not, I'm in the business of ROI, meaning that if my clients are not ROI positive or not sufficiently ROI positive, they're going to churn. I'm going to have a strong client attrition. It's going to hinder the growth of my company, and that's something that I take extremely seriously as a result. And while all of this research still feels very introductory and has a lot of room for improvement and for further research, it's super satisfactory on the business side to be able to provide guidelines and tools for my clients to maximize ROI moving forward. And I'm super excited to keep exploring further moving forward. And that's me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll happily take all of your questions.